Hey everyone, welcome to our second video about taxonomy. So in the first video, you learned how to name organisms with their genus and the species. You know that that's binomial nomenclature and that Carolus Linnaeus came up with it. And Carolus Linnaeus also came up with taxonomy, which is our system of classifying organisms. But did you know that taxonomy has changed over time? When the idea of taxonomy was first introduced, we just had the names of the kingdoms. And in the 1700s, when Carolus Linnaeus was working on this, we had animals and plants. That was it. Okay. And he didn't really know that there were fungi, that mushrooms were different from plants. He thought they were the same. So that's in 1700s. With more technology, we have actually got animals, plants, and protista, which originally included like microorganisms like bacteria that cause germs. In the 1950s, we had animal, plant, fungus. We separated fungus and plant. And then we have protista, which is protist, and monera, which includes actually all the bacteria type of organisms that are prokaryotic were here, and protista was actually all the organisms that are eukaryotic. Then in the 90s, we separated into animals, plants, fungi, protist, and then archaeobacteria and eubacteria, which are different from each other. And also in between there, in the 70s, we introduced the domain system. So not just kingdoms, but domain as being kind of like a higher category. So eukarya is a domain that includes animals, plants, fungus, and protist. Archaea includes archaeobacteria, and bacteria includes eubacteria. And we'll learn more about that later. So with naming organisms, nowadays, we don't just have the kingdoms. Above kingdoms, as something less specific, we have domains, and we have three domains. We have eukaryota, or eukarya, which means it includes animals, plants, fungus, and protist, because they all have eukaryotic cells. We also have bacteria, which is made up of eubacteria, and those are the types of bacteria that make you sick. So you get sick from eubacteria, even though that's not why it's named that, but it helps you remember. But bacteria is a domain that contains different types of eubacteria kingdoms. And archaea is a domain that includes archaebacteria kingdom, and that archaebacteria kingdom is like ancient bacteria, and it lives in extreme places like volcanoes and very, very salty conditions, or maybe very acidic conditions. So those are a different type altogether. But there are three domains that include all of life. So this is like the tree of all living things: eukaryota, archaea, and bacteria. You can see them organized a little bit differently here. We have eukaryotic organisms like plants, animals, protist, and fungus. Archaea, which is that ancient bacteria that lives in extreme places, and eubacteria, which is the bacteria that makes you sick. Those are three domains. You can also see them listed here. So this is the bacteria domain, the archaea domain, and the eukarya domain, which actually includes 1, 2, 3, 4 kingdoms within the domain eukarya. Question here: what are the three domains in modern taxonomy? So you'd want to select all three that are domains within modern taxonomy. They're eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. All right, how do scientists classify organisms into the kingdom? So we just said there are three domains, three big groups: eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. And then we divide those a little further into different kingdoms. And in kingdoms, we have animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungi, protist, archaebacteria, and eubacteria. These four kingdoms actually fall within the domain of eukarya, and these ones each fall into their own domains. Now, how do we know which organisms are in the different kingdoms? Like if I give you a random organism that you've never seen before, you would want to be able to sort it into a certain kingdom. And you would want to look at first, how many cells does it have? Is it unicellular or multicellular? So if it's multicellular, a lot of the times that means it's going to be in the eukarya domain. It's either usually going to be an animal, plant, or fungus. If it's unicellular, it could be a protist or an archaea or bacteria. You also would want to look at a second thing, how it obtains energy. So that could be, is it an autotroph or is it a heterotroph? So does it make its own food or not? If it's a heterotroph, it might be an animal or fungi or actually protist bacteria and archaea bacteria as well. But if it's an autotroph, it could be a couple of these smaller organisms, but a lot of times it would be a plant. If we're also looking to classify organism into the six kingdoms, we would first, like I said, start by looking at how many cells and how does it get its nutrition. But we would also look at what type of cells it has. So if it has eukaryotic cells, it's going to be either an animal, plant, fungi, or protist. If it has prokaryotic or simple cells, it'll be bacteria, either archaeobacteria or eubacteria. And then finally, we can compare the cell structures that it has. Like if it has a cell wall and a chloroplast, we have a good idea that it's a plant. So those are 4 ways that we can classify organisms into the 6 kingdoms: by their number of cells, how they get energy, their types of cells, and their cell structures. A little bit more about the archaea and bacteria, because you might be less familiar with those. Archaea are mostly autotroph, and a lot of them are chemoautotrophic, which means they get their energy from chemicals. So that's why they live in those extreme environments, like really acidic or really salty environments, because they use those chemicals to make their energy. Eubacteria can be autotrophic and heterotrophic, and that means some can make their own energy, but others have to get their energy from ingesting or consuming something else. All right, what are 2 ways to classify organisms into the 6 kingdoms? Well, there are 4 ways. I wanted you to name 2. You can look at the number of cells, how they get their energy, the types of cells, and the cell structures that they have. And that's based directly from this chart right here. What are 2 of our 6 kingdoms? You can think of any 2 that you would like to think of. Make sure you choose 2 kingdom names. Right. There are actually 6. Make sure you have chosen 2 of these 6. Animal, plant, fungi, protist, eubacteria, and archaea bacteria are our 6 kingdoms, and that's all of life is part of those 6 kingdoms. All right, let's talk a little bit more about how we classify things. Back in the day, like a long time ago, we would classify things based on how they physically looked. Like in the 1700s, how did they physically looked? And nowadays, we do it based on their evolutionary descent, which is also known as phylogeny. And that comes from Darwin's theory of evolution. And the big idea there is that a particular group of organisms might have a common ancestor. So the way that we used to look at it is kind of shown here. Based on physical appearances, the barnacle and the limpet look more similar to each other, and the crab is kind of on its own. So we would have classified the barnacle and the limpet together. But as it turns out, based on more scientific research, like comparing the DNA and looking at the proteins it makes and looking at how it develops, it's actually true that crabs and barnacles are more closely related, even though they don't look as similar, and that limpets are different and they would be classified on their own. So classification can change over time. And especially as technology increases, we have more ways to look at evolutionary descent and to look at the common ancestors and to reclassify organisms. So, a long time ago, classification was based on physical appearance. Now, classification is based on phylogeny, which is evolutionary descent. All right, several modern ways have come about to determine the relationships between different organisms and how closely they are related. Those 3 ways that we're going to talk about in this class are comparing biochemistry, like looking at DNA and proteins, comparing developmental stages of organisms, which you can see there, that's called embryology, and then examining and interpreting the fossil record. So, what is one modern way to determine the relationship between organisms? You're going to select all that apply here. You might be selecting more than one, actually. So, what is it? At least one modern way: DNA, developmental stages, and the fossil record. All right, comparing DNA and RNA. Similarities in DNA can be used to help determine the relationship between organisms and classify them. There is such a thing called a molecular clock, and it measures how long since two species evolved independently of each other. So you can kind of look at certain genes that organisms share, and you can determine how long ago did maybe one mutation group change from another mutation group and they became two separate species. And DNA has been a really useful thing to help us understand the relationship between organisms. So, traditionally, like in the 1700s, we would have grouped African vultures and American vultures together because they look like falcons, like they have a similar appearance to each other. But DNA actually revealed that American vultures, these ones, are actually more similar to storks genetically. And so we've had to rearrange our classification to put the American vultures and the storks together because of what DNA has revealed about them. They actually have more similar DNA than either one of them has to the African vulture. So comparing DNA has allowed us to see how long ago did two species maybe split from each other and what are the similarities in DNA. And it can also be with proteins, but DNA and RNA is more common. So, which technology has let us know that these are actually two different species who happen to look alike? One is the orange dart, and the other is the orange palm dart, and they're actually two species. That technology is DNA. When looking at DNA, how do we measure how long ago two species have been evolving independently or split from each other? That's called the molecular clock. Now, another way that we can look at classifying organisms is by comparing the developmental stages of those organisms. And here you can see the developmental stages of a fish, that's in this line, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a rabbit, and a human. And from this, I got a little too excited. You can see that these organisms might be grouped differently based on how they develop. So, salamanders and fish are much more closely related to each other based on how they look when they develop, compared to fish and humans. Fish and humans don't look that similar when they're developing. So, you can see that, for example, salamanders are more closely related to fish than humans are to fish. Okay, based on embryology, which organisms are more closely related to each other? Is it the salamander and the fish, or the salamander and the tortoise? Both of them are right next to each other in this picture, but which ones look more similar? That's the salamander and the fish. Based on embryology, which organisms are likely more closely related? The chick and the tortoise, or the chick and the rabbit? So they're both next to each other in this picture, or all three next to each other in this picture, but who's more closely related, the chick and the tortoise or the chick and the rabbit? That's the chick and the tortoise. All right, a third and final way that we look at classifying organisms based on modern technology is looking at the fossil record. And what you can tell here, the oldest rocks are down here at the bottom and the newest rocks are at the top. And you might remember this a bit from earth science, maybe not, but maybe you do. But organisms that are in the same layer of earth would have probably developed around the same time period. And so that can give us some indication of when those organisms existed and maybe when like one of those organisms might have evolved into a new or different kind of organism. All right, which species is probably the oldest in this picture? Is it species A, species B, species C, or species D? Which one do you think is older? That's A. It's all the way at the bottom. And in looking at the fossil record, the ones that are further in the bottom are usually the older ones. Which species are probably more closely related to each other? A and B, or A and D? Well, this is A and B. They are very closely related to each other, more likely because they are closer in time. This group might have descended to begin looking like this group, versus A and D, they're much further apart in time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope